France's mainstream left prevailed in Sunday's municipal elections to retain control of the country's three biggest cities, while the far right failed to take any major urban centre. The elections were seen as a test of both the depth of the far right support base a year ahead of presidential elections and the resilience of mainstream parties in a fragmented political landscape. In Paris, Emmanuel Gregoire, a socialist little known to the French public, was elected mayor of Paris, beating out prominent conservative contender Rachida Dati. Nicholas Rushworth tells us more about the new leader of the French capital.
Merci à tous.
Paris has a new mayor, Emmanuel Gregoire. He celebrated with a bike ride his win after a tense campaign, and under a list of united left and Greens, extends the socialist quarter-century rule in the French capital.
Ce soir,
tonight, this victory represents a promise, a demanding one, the triumph of a certain vision of Paris, a vibrant, progressive Paris, for the people, a Paris for everyone.
Emmanuel Gregoire was a deputy to outgoing Mayor Anne Hidalgo. Relations between them had been poor after she accused him of failing to back her unsuccessful 2022 presidential bid. Gregoire was born in the working-class Parisian suburb of Seine-Saint-Denis into a family with roots in the Communist Party. He was a consultant in the medical sector before turning to politics. His win now comes as France gears up for next year's presidential race, with the far right eyeing its best chance yet to claim the country's top office.
From Monday, our country enters its next democratic challenge, the 2027 presidential election. We had a taste of it during these municipal elections. The battle for France will be brutal, violent and crucial.
He has said he feels he's sometimes portrayed as dull when he is super cheerful, always laughing and really down to earth. He has pledged to increase the number of green spaces and the number of bike lanes in Paris.
Well, to break down the results of the municipal elections, we're joined now by Renaud Foucart, who's a senior lecturer at Lancaster University. Thank you very much for being with us on France 24. I'd like to start by talking about the far right. I mean, the National Rally, as I said, it didn't win any of those major urban centres that it had been eyeing, but it did do well in its strongholds. What do you make of the overall picture about the kinds of support for the National Rally?
It's a very regional party when you look at the local elections. It's very strange because it's the number one party in the polls on the presidential election, in parliamentary election. But when it comes to local, to grassroots support, it seems that at the moment, the National Rally barely exists outside of the north and the deep south of the country, which means that in terms of 2027, which is, of course, the main horizon of all French politicians, when the name on the ballots will not be Le Pen, as it's always been in every single presidential election, there will be a question of how much support there would be for someone who is called, for instance, Jordan Bardella, who is the front runner to run for a National Rally, in places where there was National Rally maybe 10, 15 years ago, and now all those big cities from Bordeaux, from Lyon, they will have zero National Rally representation in their municipal councils.
Yeah, you're referring to the uncertainty around Marine Le Pen's candidacy for those elections as she awaits a result in her appeals trial for an embezzlement conviction. Meanwhile, though, the socialists, they've been long weakened on the national scale, but they did well in the big cities. What could this mean for the left and the centre-left heading towards these presidential elections?
I think the big challenge for the center left will be to manage what they have to think about of a strategy of the second round. So presidential election in France has two rounds. First, you need to qualify, and then you need to win. So if they want to hope to get to the second round, they need to talk to voters on the left, but also to voters who currently support Jean-Luc Mélenchon's far left. So they need to be strong there. But the problem when they do that is that in the second round, supporting Jean-Luc Mélenchon seemed to be extremely divisive. So if you had a lot of cities within localities where the left was overall a majority, where there were alliances between the left and the far left, but they failed to win because centrist voters are really, really scared by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. So if they want to have a hope to have a center-left candidate to the second round, they will have to walk a very, very tightrope to qualify. As for the far left, they seem to have a very strong basis, perhaps stronger than expected. So they failed to win any meaningful big city. They were not particularly good in terms of winning even smaller ones, but still everywhere they get those 10% that make them very hard to ignore for the center left, and clearly a big strategic difficulty for the next elections for them.
So if then the lesson for the socialists or the Greens or the communists is that they do better without linking up with France unbowed, what does that mean for the elections in 2027? Does that put two competing visions of the French left going head to head?
Two competing versions, but it's not that much that they do better when they are not with French unbowed. They cannot ignore them. I think the Greens are the best examples, because the Greens, unlike the Socialist Party, at the national level, they've stayed very far away from the current government. So they've been together almost on a de facto alliance with France unbowed. So the Greens, they had mayors in several big cities, and they lost many of them. I think the Greens are the only big losers of yesterday's election. And the problem is that they were in those alliances, but they failed to win new voters. But if they didn't ally with France unbowed, they would have lost those voters on the left. And so the real difficulty for them is to try to reconcile those two lefts. And in a two-round system, it's possible, but the most likely scenario, in my opinion, right now, is that none of the left party qualify for the second round, because there is too much division between them. And so there is a large avenue right now for a center-right candidate to qualify against Bardella and to have a larger chance to win than any left candidate at the moment.
Well, speaking of former Prime Minister Edouard Philippe was re-elected mayor in the port city of Le Havre. He has already announced his candidacy for the presidential race, and he's seen as one of the main contenders for the centre. How much of a boost does this result give his presidential hopes?
He was not in a very good place 2 weeks ago. He's in a much better place today, let's put it that way. So he's not someone who is doing incredibly well in the poll. He was kind of a de facto favorite because it seems there is basically nobody else. Gabriel Attal, perhaps the other possible heir of Emmanuel Macron, but he's doing even worse than Philippe in the polls. So his hope is that he's been there, he's waiting for the moment, and he has something that a lot of the other possible candidates don't have, is that he has this credibility of being a man who represents Le Havre, which is clearly a working class city, a place that has more communist roots than a center-right one, and is proven that he can talk to, say, normal people. And also he has, I think, this credibility of having a very right-wing discourse in terms of migration, security. And so in a second round against Bardella, I think he would be in a very good position. The question is what happens until 2027, and can he qualify to this second round? And this is something that someone like him who doesn't have like massive charisma is, I think, always looking to his left and to his right to see if there is someone more charismatic, more visible, who will emerge in the coming months.
Okay, well, how can we interpret the overall turnout? This was 57%, so the country's lowest in local polls, except for the pandemic edition in 2020. Does this reflect a population disenchanted by politics?
It reflects an election that was mostly local politics, and I think it's largely a great thing. One of the reasons why there is no visible winner in that election is that no one could go and vote against Emmanuel Macron in the election. So people had to look at very local issues and put the most competent or their preferred local person. In many places, there was barely any competition because France has a lot of very small communes. But also, even in places when there was competition, it was not super intense. But in a way, it's also why, like today, we can look at this map of France and we can look at what people actually really want. And this gives us this really strange regional picture with, in Paris, what people really like is the mobility plans of Delanoë and Hidalgo. They just want to cycle and there will be no right-wing candidate to win until they go on a bike. In other parts, they care about security. In other parts, they care about the economy. And they voted according to their local needs. And I think this map will prove very useful for the next elections. And as for participation, I think people are obviously less likely to participate when an election is not too polarizing. And I think somehow, maybe in those days, it's a good news not to be too polarizing.
And just before we run out of time, I wanted to ask you, because we've just heard this Monday that former French Prime Minister Lionel Jospin has died, aged 88. He, a socialist, he withdrew from politics after the far-right leader Jean-Marie Le Pen beat him and his party to the second round of presidential elections in 2002. His voters then backed Jacques Chirac to block the far-right from power. This time on, are we still seeing this Republican Front, as it's called, where rival parties band together to shut out the far right?
Well, time has changed quite a lot since this massive demonstration against Jean-Marie Le Pen. Lionel Jospin was an incredible state person. The man was the arch favorite to win the presidential election, but he failed to qualify by a very tiny margin. But there was no discussion. Everyone was against Jean-Marie Le Pen to defend French democracy. The problem at the moment in France is that you have a large front against the far left, a medium front against the far right, and a lot of people who think that defending French democracy means doing without only one of the two. And I think no, right now, perhaps the brand of the far right is much less toxic, which can be either a good or a bad news. It's a good news because it means that Le Pen and Bardella are not like Jean-Marie Le Pen. They are not having those permanent anti-Semitic, racist, homophobic outbursts that are perhaps more within the French Republic. But at the same time, it means that the French are perhaps ready to have perhaps less traditionally democratic party. And we've seen in Hungary, we've seen in Slovakia, we've seen in Poland at some point that this can be very dangerous for your institutions when you stop protecting your democracy.
All right, Renu Fukar from Lancaster University, thank you very much. We'll have to leave it there.